My name is Charles Wellford, as Howard indicated. I apparently am not one of his friends, but I'm glad to know him. But I am old, and so I'm Nancy's friend, so that makes up for it for sure. I'm reporting, the presentation today is based on a project funded by NIJ to the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And this is the front page from a paper that's under review. And I wanted to highlight the three graduate students, Megan Collins, Tom Scott, and Susan Parker, who have just been exceptional in working on this project with me. I'm going to pull things out of that today, but also add some of my own thoughts, so they're not responsible for any slide after this one. Lots of people involved in this project. I won't name all of them. You see them here, but I do want to emphasize the role the IACP has played. They are the grantee for this project. They've been instrumental in helping us gain access to agencies and to state police agencies and have managed this entire process. And then, of course, the two police departments, New Orleans and Prince George's County Police Departments, who showed, I think, great courage in agreeing to be participants in this project. And of course, NIJ for funding us. So as we began this project, we had a particular approach to what we thought was our current understanding of how guns get to criminals, how gun markets operate. But as the National Research Council's report indicated in 2005, what we know is more conceptual than empirical. We know that guns are sold mostly through legal dealers. They go to people who most of them don't use them in a crime, but 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 years later, that gun shows up with the police department recovering it during or after a commission of a crime. The empirical research we have are mostly from trace studies. Traces are where guns that are recovered by police are submitted to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosions, and from now on I'll call them ATF. And they run a national tracing center out in West Virginia that reports back to the police department where that gun originated, who purchased it, when, where, those kinds of things. So we have studies that have looked at trace results, but these have tended to be in individual communities, not many comparative studies, and they're often in high regulation states, Massachusetts, Illinois, California, because that's where many of the best researchers in the gun violence, gun research area operate. And then there have been inmate studies. Inmate studies are typically surveys or interviews that are done with inmates. You may be familiar with Jim Wright's and Peter Rossi's early work in 1984 on Armed and Dangerous, a major national survey of inmates. And then there's the BJS surveys of prisoners, asking them where they get their guns, and then individuals have done surveys throughout the year. What we find, though, is that these two approaches to studying gun markets don't occur in the same study. They're usually done differently, and they're done at different times with different samples, and that creates some difficulty in trying to get at the two ends of the gun market continuum, the end of first sale and the end of criminals who've used them in guns. So this gap in between first legal sale and use is relatively unknown from an empirical scientific perspective. So what we've done in this study, which is now coming to an end, we're due to finish up by the end of October, or maybe it's the 1st of October, but yeah, it's the 1st, Betsy tells me. The 1st of October, is to select 3 jurisdictions. 2 were funded by NIJ to us. Chicago came in through the cooperation of Phil Cook and the Crime Lab at the University of Chicago, in which we get trace data, we do inmate surveys, and we try to interview individuals who were first legal purchasers. This shows you the components, the tracing, what we call tracking, where we're interviewing individuals who purchased the gun, and prison interviews in these 3 jurisdictions. And if you can make out the letter grades, this is the Center for Law Center for Prevention of Gun Violence is grade for these jurisdictions in their regulations. So we try to introduce some notion of variation in regulation, with Prince George's being a very high regulation jurisdiction, Louisiana and New Orleans not so much, and Chicago reasonably good. We don't claim anywhere in our work that we're able to precisely estimate the effect of these regulations, but we do note where there are differences in some of these gun patterns that we've looked at. So in each of these areas, in Prince George's, we collect the traced guns. You see the number for the 2-year time period. We do interviews with inmates who are serving time for committing a crime with a gun in that jurisdiction through the same 2-year period, but we can't link them to the particular trace for lots of reasons. And then on terms of tracking, we've identified about 200 individuals. We haven't finished collecting this, but I'll report to you some preliminary stuff on 181 individuals who were the first legal purchaser and what they say happened to the gun. Here's what, at the end, I will tell you are our general conclusions about this research. First, gun recoveries and trace successes vary across jurisdictions and in some locations by crime. Second, gun regulations do matter because they seem to be associated with certain characteristics of the market, the proportion of guns purchased in state, and the time to recovery, or what sometimes is called time to crime. But we did not find that the variations in regulation were associated with the likelihood of the purchaser and possessor being the same person, or with the likelihood of the gun being bought by a straw purchaser. First, legal owners tell us that guns that end up being used in violent crime are mostly stolen from them, or they've sold it to the person who became the offender, or they sold it to someone else. And in prison, gun offenders cited stealing or buying a gun off the street as the most likely way to obtain a firearm that's used in crime. I'll tell you, without spending half an hour talking about methodology, I have pretty good confidence in conclusions 1 and 2, and in 4. 3, for reasons that I may be able to go into if we have time. We know we have missed things in the interviews of first legal owners, mainly because we couldn't find them, or they're dead, or they were police officers, or something else. So let me briefly give you the some nuggets of the actual findings that support these ideas. So on gun recoveries, we found that across the jurisdictions, less than 20% of violent gun crimes resulted in a recovery of a firearm. Mostly that's because of the low clearance rate for many violent crimes. And so if the crime isn't cleared, there's a low probability of a gun being recovered. So firearms are more likely to be recovered after homicides and unlikely following armed robberies. In New Orleans, we were actually able to compare the crimes where guns were recovered and where they were not, and there were substantial differences in the types of crimes, the types of victims, the types of offenders, and where they occurred within the city. So the trace results are very important for law enforcement, but they must be treated with a recognition that they're incomplete, and that incompleteness can give a distorted or biased picture of what the gun crime situation looks like in any particular jurisdiction. There are unsuccessful traces. We found that in most jurisdictions, you see bullet 2, there's some variation, but about 2/3 to 75% of guns that are submitted for tracing are successfully traced. The most common reasons for unsuccessful traces differed only slightly across jurisdictions and primarily reflect how we've decided to capture and trace guns. Here are some of those. It's kind of small, but they're mainly administrative reasons. The dealer's out of business. There was a problem with the submission. Obliteration of serial numbers is certainly important, but other reasons for failure tend to be more important. I said here's a way in which gun regulations are associated. You see the top line, which is New Orleans, the higher percentage of in-state purchases of guns that are recovered in crimes. For the other two jurisdictions, the regulations seem to result or are associated with lower percentage of in-state purchases, more out-state. That certainly makes sense. But, of course, this is obviated by the fact that these states may be near other states where regulations are not as strong. And so in Maryland, a lot of guns purchased in Virginia, et cetera. Mean time to recovery, you see in a low regulation jurisdiction, the mean time to recovery is about 8.5 years, whereas for the other two jurisdictions, it's considerably longer. That means there's more cost involved in these gun situations. However, it doesn't make a difference in purchaser possessor. In Prince George's County, 26% of the first original purchaser, legal purchaser, were people who used the gun and possessed the gun in a crime, 15% in Chicago, 19% in New Orleans. And I think that speaks somewhat to David's point about the efforts in Massachusetts to address that purchase by people who passed the background check. Here's the specific data on movement from first legal sale. This is what the 181 people report to us, what happened to the gun. 41% said it was stolen, 9% sold or traded to a gun store, sold or traded at a gun show, 2% sold to the offender. You see the numbers. We asked people if they said it was stolen, whether they had reported to the police. Most said they did not, so that stolen number could be a socially acceptable way of saying something else, but that is what is reported. Imprisoned gun offenders, the middle bar is a combination of things that are off the street. They either bought it, they stole it, or they traded for it, but the gun came off the street. As one of our interviewers said, I don't know why you're asking me about guns. There aren't any gun manufacturing plants in my neighborhood. There aren't even any gun stores. If you want to know about guns, go talk to the white people that bring them into our community and sell them. That's a predominant thought in many of our surveys and interviews. So that's where the guns are coming from. Those millions of guns that David was talking that are out there are ending up in hands of people who commit crimes through theft, through purchasing on the street from drug dealers and others, and from trading and borrowing. So now to the implications for law enforcement. I divide these into two categories, and the first two really speak to things that are beyond the total control of law enforcement. If guns are being stolen, if guns are being purchased out on the street, then we need enforceable tools to address transfers from legal owners into the unregulated market. Now, some states, including Maryland, Massachusetts, have required that for every transfer, if I buy a gun and transfer it to Howard, I have to report that, or I have to do it through an FFL. That is some mechanism. But as Anthony Braga and David Heroux recently showed in a paper in Preventive Medicine, in Massachusetts, only about 30% of the guns that end up in crime that were transferred some way into the underground market were reported in the way they should be. And part of that's an enforcement issue. And so I emphasize the enforceable tools to give us a picture of what these transfers are, where they're going, and who should have these guns. And I think also outside of local law enforcement's control is improvements in trace data. I think if you go out to the National Tracing Center sometime and see the remarkable job that these people are doing in giving trace results back to agencies. But they are significantly hampered by the way in which we've decided to do systems of information about gun purchases. And that's another whole hour conversation, but I think it's an important one that we need to keep in mind. And the police chief in May of this year, Megan Collins, one of the students working on this paper, and Carlos Acosta from spelled his name wrong, I'm sorry, Acosta from the Prince George's County Police Department, we did a paper entitled, What Police Can Do to Prevent Gun Violence. And to summarize it in the minute I have left, basically we said police in the last 15 years have learned how to address crime by collecting better data, analyzing those data, and understanding what drives the crime situation, and then addressing those underlying drivers. That's the same strategy that needs to be applied to gun markets and guns. You see that happening more and more in police by focusing on what might be called trigger shooters or high-risk individuals. They're at high risk for committing gun crimes or being victims of gun crime. But our suggestion in that article, and I'm just repeating it today, is that same approach and focus should be addressing gun markets and how to interrupt them. Once that's done, if you use that approach, these departments will be using the kinds of strategies I've described in our research, surveys, tracing data, interviewing first legal purchasers, or getting access to those databases that states should have that describe secondary transfers, and using that to better understand. I can't tell you how many police departments I've been to over the last few years in which their use of trace data is their primary source of understanding their gun markets, and who use it primarily on an individual case basis, use it to try to solve a case, than to use it for a strategic understanding of what their gun market situation might look. Once you've taken those two steps, then as was said earlier in the introduction, as David mentioned, there are programs of proven successfulness in crimesolutions.gov, in other sources of information about what works, that police can draw upon. We talk about them in that article. I don't have time here to repeat it, but I think police can use the strategies, the approach that has worked so well to reduce crime. I don't think anybody we can argue about how much it's contributed, and we can discuss whether the strategies used have reduced confidence in the police in certain segments of the community, but we can't deny the fact that this approach of data-driven, evidence-driven policing has made a difference. I think we can do the same thing in the area of gun markets and gun crimes. Thank you.